Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tom Banshoff and Pankaj Mishra, for putting this extraordinary event together over this week. I am Safwan Masri. I'm Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar, and I'm delighted to be here with you to introduce our two afternoon panels. In keeping with the objective of the conference, which is to connect leading thinkers of the Global South and North, I am particularly delighted that Georgetown University in Qatar is a proud co-sponsor of this event. You heard earlier this week from one of our students, Rhodes Scholar Asma Shakil. She is, in many respects, quintessentially representative of the almost 500 students who come to Qatar from more than 70 countries to enroll in our Bachelor's in Foreign Service program. The discussion underway this week at Georgetown, the discussions are urgently needed because the divisions we're witnessing globally are more pronounced and disconcerting than at any period, at least in my lifetime. We are beset by wars and bear witness to unspeakable atrocities in Gaza, the West Bank, Ukraine, Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere. Democratic principles and institutions, including many elite universities in this country, are on the receiving end of sustained, and I'm sad to say, devastatingly effective attacks. We know that the most complex and stubborn problems facing humanity cannot and will not be solved by any single state actor. Yet too many of the people we most urgently need to come to the table often do not show up, or if they do, they talk down to others or at others. Ironically, at the same time, when not enough people are seriously and sincerely communicating, we now live in a world that is burying us beneath an avalanche of words. Billions of them clog our screens daily, words that are often empty or misleading or toxic. The communications technologies available today make it possible for people on opposite sides of the world to connect instantly. Yet we are more fractured, polarized, and disconnected than ever. In the midst of all the ceaseless talking at one another, we somehow lost the ability to listen. We desperately need either to learn or relearn that vital skill. And we need to start listening to people who historically have been denied a voice, such as the Palestinians, whose struggle for liberation has become synonymous with the imperative to free the people of the world. This is why we're here today, not to rehash what's wrong, but to figure out how to get things right, how to put things back on track, or on track for the first time. We're here to foster what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter, a place and a mindset that values constructive conversation. The peaceful, equitable world for which we yearn won't become a reality unless and until we embrace a new framework for engagement and discussion. The frameworks built in the 1990s at the dawn of the globalized era were made in America for America, not with the rest of the world and not for the entire world. The rest of the world, which has registered its displeasure at being left out of the conversation, now has our attention, which is why we must create new spaces for global dialogue and encounter, spaces that accommodate rising powers and the voices of the Global South, who, as you'll hear shortly, may be able to help avert escalating tensions between the US and China, for example, assuming that the superpowers begin to value their perspectives, of course. We need new frameworks and new spaces that invite more inclusive conversations, spaces that also accommodate the world's young people, whose idealism is unrivaled, but whose anxiety over their political, economic, social, and environmental futures are understandably acute. We need to give greater voice and agency to students and encourage them to work together across borders to advance positive change, which is exactly what we're doing at Georgetown. Our campus in Doha provides us with an opportunity to engage with the world, to examine America's role in the world from within the world, to study global phenomena and histories from a Global South perspective, and to provide a liberal, world-class education to future leaders who otherwise would not be able to access it. The exchange of ideas between our faculty and students in Doha and in Washington, D.C. enriches both campuses. It enables a truly globally minded academic mission that is consistent with this university's Jesuit values of caring for each other and for the world we inhabit. Our campus in Doha and our expanding global initiatives, which include establishing a presence in Indonesia, is more critical today than it perhaps ever was. I'm honored to join our faculty and students as we seek to learn from and more attentively listen to each other. And now to our panels this afternoon. Our first panel, Fostering Global Solidarities, will examine the surge of nationalism around the world, how it undercuts efforts to forge a vibrant global civil society, and the new approaches that must be adopted to foster transnational solidarity and action. Our second panel, entitled Cold War 2.0, The View from the Rest of the World, will explore the disastrous implications for the international community if a Cold War between the US and China escalates. The panel will consider how other countries, international institutions, and transnational movements might help to avert a US-China confrontation. So at this point, I'd like to invite Veronica Gago, Ranjit Hoskotai, Kohei Saito, Peter Beinart, and Joel Hellman, who will be in a conversation with our moderator, New York Times opinion columnist Lydia Polgreen, to come to the stage and kick off our first panel. Thank you very much.
Great crowd. Thanks so much for coming out. And what an incredibly esteemed group. We have a hard out at 3:15, so I'm going to be an absolutely ruthless dictatorial moderator and keep the trains running on time. Uh-oh, already down one. So it's incredibly fitting that we're having this conversation about global solidarity at a moment when the entire country is seized with an astonishingly powerful protest movement led by young people in solidarity with the nation in the global south that I would argue is the most in need of our solidarity, and that's Palestine. I spent much of last week on campus with students, attending protests, hanging out with them while they're waiting for their classmates to get out of jail, and it's just been a really extraordinary thing to witness. So I definitely want to hear what you all have to say about that. But just to step back a little bit, the early years of the millennium. They promised, some might say threatened, a moment of kind of global convergence, a technological age that was going to accelerate the erosion of the physical borders, and globalization was going to, make us all richer and happier, this technological can-do spirit. But this narrative really fundamentally relied on a continuation of a trajectory that was set by the global north, and that the global south had very little say in. And in many ways, really didn't work for the global south, even as the global south was condescendingly being ushered upward on the ladder of quote unquote development and prosperity, supposedly more modern, supposedly more egalitarian vision of how the global north had grown rich. We all know, because you've all written so eloquently in various ways about it, what actually happened and how it all came crashing down. And so there are a couple of themes, and I'm going to introduce each of you, but there are a couple of big themes that I just want everyone to have kind of top of mind in this conversation. One is that I sense in all of your work a really brave and important refusal of binaries, ideas of hardened separation, the idea that things can be both and. So that's a theme I'd really like to explore. The other is, I think, an abiding belief in the primacy of human agency and creativity in the face of the forces, of the fascistic forces that are emergent. And I think that we have all tried in our various fields to find these places of interconnectedness. My real hope is that we can really focus on what's the glue that we can emphasize that brings us to greater solidarity, and then also what are the solvents that are dissolving the bonds of solidarity between us, and how do we push back against them? Next to me, I have, and I'm going to do very short intros because you can read all about these incredible people, and I don't want to lose a minute of our conversational time. But Veronica Gago is a professor of social sciences at the University of Buenos Aires. She's a feminist, she's a political activist, a political theorist. She's written many books on many topics, including neoliberalism, feminism, and so on. So I'm very excited to talk with you about your work. Ranjit Hoskote is an Indian poet. He's really a polymath, a theorist, a curator. His work is deeply influential, and it centers on the complex history and presence of cultural pluralism from the local to the global. He's written many, many books, and I won't bore you with naming all of them, but I'm very, very much excited to talk about our relationship to history with you, among many other things. Kohei Saito is a philosopher at the University of Tokyo, and he's also a leading contemporary Marxist thinker. And his work really centers on questions of growth, questions of climate, and how we can start to think about what a future beyond growth might look like. His very, very influential book, Slow Down, The Degrowth Manifesto, was published early this year in English. A huge bestseller in Japan. Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science. He's also a colleague whose work I'm proud to appear alongside from time to time. I think it's fair to say that Peter, whether it's as a teacher or as editor at large at Jewish Currents, as a commentator writing his columns in the Times, has emerged as a really essential voice to explore ideas and paths forward in a situation that just feels utterly hopeless. And he's someone that I personally have turned to many times when I felt hopeless in the last few months. And then we have Joel Hellman, who is the dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. But more importantly, he's also someone who has worked all across the globe in poverty alleviation at the World Bank, conflict moderation and resolution in Kenya. He and I were neighbors in Delhi, would walk our dogs together. And I think just someone who has a lot of really fascinating and important things to say about the crucial role that America can play in giving birth to the New World Order, a role that is not one of domination, but ideally one of collaboration and solidarity. Whew, I really need to shut up now. I've talked for a long time. All right, so let's dive in. I want to start with you, Veronica. I'd love to hear you just reflect on what we're seeing on university campuses today. You obviously helped. We're a major part of the Ni Una Menos protests in 2019. 500,000 people came out. Walk us through sort of like what's required to build those coalitions and solidarities for a movement like that, to have that kind of size and power. And what are your reflections for the students who are out there marching today?
Well, thank you very much for your presentation and question that is politically very relevant for us. I think it is very powerful, that image of the students in the campus, in the encampment, protesting. I think it's a very powerful call to revolt against the genocide in Palestine. So for me, it's a powerful image to the world. And also, I think that nowadays the universities are being spaces of political activism. In Argentina, some days ago, there was a huge manifestation for public education against our current government, that is an authoritarian neoliberal government, and he wants to defund and cut all the budget for public universities. And also, I saw that in France, there are some other protests at the universities. So the youth activism at the universities, in a moment that right wing is an anti-intellectual project also. And it is, for me, a very interesting issue to think what is a politicization of our spaces, how we inhabit our universities, and especially, as you were saying, how we build and expand our alliances. Because I think, for example, in Argentina, it's very important how the political activism at universities, but also in popular neighborhoods, but also in feminist collectives, the main issue is how to build expanded alliances with other sectors and to produce very inclusive political movements. And I think that is also a challenge because all the neoliberal subjectivation is you have your protest and it is yours and it is closed and it is your demand and that's all. And I think that the political challenge is to produce a political translation of our struggles and try to connect and try to produce also a transnational dimension of our political demands and political struggles. So for me, it's a vital sign see that uprising in the campus here, and also a way to rethink what is knowledge nowadays, what is the function of knowledge, what is also the function of the social media to translate those images in political messages in other spaces, and how we produce a connection between very different landscapes and countries and vocabularies also.
So this idea of sort of about thinking about linkages and ways to bring people together, and you know, feminism has that sort of global dimension. One of the things, Ranjit, about your work is that you work a lot with the past, and we're living in a time of, you know, kind of deep obsession with the past. You know, we have, you know, revanchist movements on the right that are, you know, India, obviously, Modi. In his case, really and in most of these cases, a fictionalized past that never really existed. And it strikes me that at the core of your work is an effort to kind of recast our relationship with the past and to both use it to help us understand the present, but also loosen the bonds that the past might hold on us. So could you talk a little bit about that work and how that might apply to the struggles that we're talking about today?
Thank you for that, Lydia. Also, I would like to say how amazed and excited I am to be here in the US at this particular time. I honestly never thought I would see anything like this in my lifetime. I belong to a generation that regretted not having been around in 1968. So, you know, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, all of this was part of the lore we inherited from the generation that preceded us. And to see this primal scene of revolution playing out in this way here, in some ways at the heart of the world order, has been really salutary in many ways. Because among many other things, I think it also reminds us that crafting a political location for ourselves is not only about thinking through where and how we belong, but it's also about, very importantly, what we stand against, and to define and contour that, and to do it in this transnational, transcultural, transregional way. That, to my mind, is truly, truly hopeful. You know, it does remind me, for instance, of the kinds of worldviews we grew up with in South Asia, which had to do with non-alignment. But I'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to try and do this as briskly and succinctly as I can. I just want to say that what we're seeing around the world today in terms of the rise of, I'm going to use the word fascism, I'm aware it's a somewhat vexed term, but wherever we see these autocratic totalitarian regimes which want to work from a very narrow and monopolistic view, a singular view of the past, to my mind that only plays up, it dramatizes a fundamental pathology that's implicit in any nation state. The modern nation state, as we all know this, we sometimes forget it. The modern nation state really stands on the ground of exclusion. Exclusions and expulsions have defined most modern nation states. And I think that rather than work with this negative, destructive spirit of revanchism, working out of a fictive notion of what tradition is, I've found very useful the term anamnesia. I mean, how do you bear witness to your plural pasts? How do you expressly retrieve memories that complicate your sense of who you are, complicate your sense of what your past is? In our own case in India, for instance, I think because we've inherited a particular colonial cartography, we've tended to cut ourselves off from very, very replenishing connections we've had with through the Indian Ocean networks, with the Arab Peninsula, with East Africa, and all of that. This is just one example I offer. I think we need to seek these connections out because it just helps us to get away from the immobilization of historical narrative. Mm-hmm. So that's part of what I would think of. This leads me to think about figures like the bridge builder or the border crosser. I think these are crucial figures that we need to keep in mind. But I also want to think of a more proximate temporal horizon. I'm thinking of the post-colonial visions of convergence and collaboration across borders that had a much more optimistic and redemptive narrative to offer us as a nascent nation state. Thinking here of all of these events of the 1950s, the Bandung Conference, the Afro-Asian Solidarity Congress in Cairo in 1957, and the emergence of the non-aligned movement. Mm-hmm. It was characterized, particularly here, as a giving up of the responsibility of standing with the free world against the Soviet bloc. We know these narratives. I think it was really about not losing the hard-won freedoms of the anti-colonial struggle and to make our own way, a third way in the world, and to seek out our own destiny. So I think we need to draw on those histories too. And, it strikes me as I'm speaking that we tend to sometimes speak of the global South as if it's post-colonial. The global North is also post-colonial. Empires that have lost their colonies are also post-colonial. They live both conceptually and in very material terms with the outcomes of the loss of empire, and they are equally involved in this enterprise. There's no neutral objectivity here. So I'd like us all maybe to think together about this common predicament and to see how there were processes and pedagogies that we were all part of. I'm getting to the point of anecdotage, I can see. But I'm just thinking back, when I think of what my generation, which came of age in the late 80s or 90s, drew on, I think we were inspired and informed by very replenishing forms of pedagogy that came to us from Latin America, actually. I'm thinking very, very strongly of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, of Ivan Illich's ideas of critical deschooling society. So I want us to be able to think of how these circulations from below, if you will, are still important. How do we recover them? How do we continue with them? So I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to think of this kind of experimental, radical, redemptive pedagogy as a way of dealing with many of our present questions.
Yeah, and I'd love to come back to that and to the sort of nuclear fallout of that imperial experience on both the colonized and the colonizer. Kohei, I'd love to hear you just talk about. I think all of us were reared with this kind of fantasy of limitless growth. Can you help us understand why it is a fantasy and how both kind of productionist Marxism and late capitalism have sort of run us aground in this particular moment? One of the most exciting and challenging ideas in your work is this decoupling of abundance from growth. So perhaps you could talk about how we move beyond the zero sum of the neoliberal model that we've all grown up with.
Maybe let me talk about something else, because I talked about it in the last few days, and Tom will be bored to hear the same thing over and over. And
perfect.
And thank you for people coming to, especially students coming to this global dialogue today, because it's a George Washington Day, and I would love to Georgetown, Georgetown Day. the Georgetown Day today. I would love to join, but I had to come today because I didn't come yesterday. And because I actually participated in the rally and the demonstration with the students for the Palestinian people. And I walked down with the students to George Washington University. And I stayed there for a couple hours. And and it really changed my perception of divide, which is the topic of our session. So I want to talk about it. Because when I usually talk about divide in the context of degrowth, it's usually, yes, as you mentioned, it's infinite growth in global north is always associated with actually the externalization, and it's actually imperial mode of living at the cost of people in the global south, which leads to further divide. And so that's why the global north needs some kind of different idea of abundance and the degrow our society and so on and so on, which kind of assumes that the divide is actually between the global north and south, or as in the introduction, the divide is usually allocated in the global divide between the US and Russia, US and China. That's usually so it's outside. The divide is projected somewhere outside. But I think it's now that kind of perception of the divide functions like an ideology in the sense of hiding the true divide within the US. And this divide within the US is, however, usually associated with Republicans and Democratic, and then how those authoritarian right-wing fascism might come to the US, threatening democracy and so on. And that kind of discourse is not particular to the US, it's everywhere in Europe too. But yesterday, those news surrounding the student protests and then actually arresting those students came to my own conclusion that the divide is actually within our own group or our own class. Because it's, actually the president of Columbia University, which is like supposedly super liberal university, ordering to arrest their own students, which is really a very different kind of accident that's going on. And then white women professor of economics at some universities getting arrested. And this is really a different kind of police action. It's not like black people getting arrested by the order of Donald Trump or something like that. It is really, those people with whom I usually have great respect, ordering to arrest students and do something against those students who are, in a peaceful manner, arguing for, or demanding ceasefire or something like that. And then these are the basic ideas of democracy, human rights, diversity, and these are the ideas that I really endorse. And that's why I came to the US 20 years ago as an undergraduate student to come to, study those ideas, because I thought that the US is a much better place than Japan, where things are more conservative and, so I thought that there's no democracy in Japan, so I wanted to come to the US to study about those things. But now, after 20 years, it seems that the democracy in the US is also a kind of in the crisis, but not because of Trump. That's my point. And this situation is something really new, and we have to think about it, because otherwise, countries like Russia and China would really say, oh, this is a double standard, and this is all bullshit, this democracy doesn't exist and so on. But it's not something that what we want to do. It's really recognizing the insufficiency of democracy and diversity and other kinds of concepts like justice and human rights. This is the kind of universal ideas must be preserved. We cannot have some kind of relativism or cynicism. So in order to do this, I think we need really to really think in a different way. I think in this sense, I wanted to yesterday kind of express my solidarity with those students who are trying to bring out a true universality instead of simply rejecting that kind of idea of universal freedom or justice, or simply being satisfied with very Eurocentric, almost hypocritical idea of democracy and the diversity.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because I think that one of the things that I've seen in these protests and among the people who are, let's just call them us, the nice, educated, progressive, well-meaning people, is this very strong desire to draw a very clear line between college students and other elements who are protesting, and to see this as a yes, we can be supportive even if we have some questions of the college students who are protesting, but not the anarchists who are aligned with them, or the more kind of radical elements. So there is an interesting binary thinking at work there as well, and the sort of insider-outsider questions that come with that. So I mean, Peter, I feel like we've been watching you live and think through the questions at the heart of this discussion, like basically in real time, in a very kind of personal and anguished way, since October 7th. So I guess I would just love for you to reflect. I'm not even going to attempt to serve up a question. What do you want to talk about?
I mean, I guess since we're in the middle of the holiday of Passover, I've been thinking a bit about the way in which Jews, but also other people, tell certain stories about ourselves, which have certain implications. So, and are not and need to be open to different kinds of stories. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is that the story of Passover can be told as a very nationalistic story. In fact, I recently came across a supplement that David Ben-Gurion wrote for the Haggadah, the kind of the text that you read on Passover for his kibbutz, and it was during the 1956 war. So it's really all about basically imagining the Egyptians of that story as the Egyptians of Nasser's government, and how there were going to be plagues against them and they were all going to be destroyed. But the Jewish tradition also imagines stories that many of the Jews didn't leave Egypt because they decided to essentially accept their bondage, and that a whole group of non-Israelites actually left along, this exodus is not an Israelite exodus. It includes this group called the Erev Rav, this mixed multitude of all kinds of people who basically take the opportunity to leave bondage. And there's a midrash which suggests that that in the 10th plague, which is the killing of the firstborn, that imagines that firstborn as many of those firstborn Egyptians being killed by their own parents because they were in an uprising against Pharaoh's subjugation, and I think those stories seem to me what these people in this movement are trying to do, which is tell a different kind of story about what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be Palestinian, think beyond the notion of a kind of tribal conflict. And for me in particular, we were talking earlier about South Africa, I'm the child of South Africans, to me it rehearses, I think, an old Jewish conversation which has happened in various different places about the question of where our security lies. And so I think when I watch this debate between these Republicans in Congress, who basically are in line with the American Jewish establishment saying security for Jews lies in an alliance with us, in the building of a ethno-nationalist white Judeo-Christian supremacist state, versus these Jewish students in the encampments, I think it brought me back to this moment in South African history of the Rivonia trial. In 1964, the trial when Mandela gets sentenced to prison for 27 years, all of the white defendants are Jews. 2 of the 5 defense lawyers are Jews. And that's the part that South Africans, to the degree they think about it, anyone tends to think about, people tend to think about that. But what people tend to focus on less was that the prosecutor, Percy Yutar, the deputy attorney general of the Transvaal, was also Jewish. In fact, he was a quite prominent figure in Jewish circles in Johannesburg. And he was the man who prosecuted Mandela. And what was happening in this debate between people like Percy Yutar on the one hand and people like Dennis Goldberg and Joseph Joffe and Lionel Bernstein on the other was a question about who Jews would align with for safety. Is it to look upwards towards a kind of dominant group that offers you whiteness, not all Jews, but offers many Jews whiteness and offers a kind of security of the powerful? Or is it to join in a kind of new within this idea of the kind of Erev Rav, of the mixed multitude of people from many different backgrounds who have their own stories of oppression. And I think that thinking in those terms is something that's really being done by young people, often very much in very much open conflict with their own communities that they were raised in and their own parents. And I think it's a really remarkable thing to see. And the thing that of all of the horror that the last 6 months have seen, what I have found is the most powerful and moving thing to me is to see the way this group of young American Jews is perceived by Palestinians and by other people. And the way I talked to a doctor in Gaza a few weeks ago, and I asked him what he had noticed about the things happening outside in the world. And this was a man, as you might imagine, who was practicing medicine under the most unspeakable conditions. And he said, well, I came across this group called Jewish Voice for Peace, and all of us were talking about it, in our clinic, So to me, that's a vision of a kind of global solidarity that certainly was not produced in my generation, but maybe will be produced by this generation.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful. When we think about the world that we're living in now, we think about the world that was in many ways created by the United States. And the United States, I think if the sort of the nice way to describe it is, we've been engaged in trying to kind of pull other countries up with us, and had complicated relationships with different places for particular reasons. But Joel, I think you have a sense of how the United States is missing opportunities and perhaps really just making a complete hash of the opportunity to manage the transition from one world to another. So maybe you could just walk us through what's that transition that's happening and how are we screwing it up?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm trying to think about which hat of the global north you want me to wear. Is it the university administrator hat, the former World Bank hat? I've seen many vantage points of the global north thinking about the world. But I think the hash up, if you will, and actually I think that the challenge for us to think about in terms of understanding narratives that will get us out of the division is a recognition that actually the period that we've lived through in the last 30 years has had some absolutely extraordinary sort of shifts in the well-being of humanity around the world. Now, whether the narrative is that America pulled that up, which is not a narrative that I would share, but nevertheless, the recognition that 1.5 billion people in a 30-year span have moved out of extreme poverty, and with that, extraordinary, just truly extraordinary sort of shifts in almost every indicator of global well-being, still excluding enormous parts of the population. So with that extraordinarily important caveat, but nevertheless recognizing that these 30 years, for all of the exclusions, all of the difficulties, all of the conflicts that we've had, all of the divisions, nevertheless kind of produced this extraordinary sort of shift in global well-being. Now, the problem I have is that the narrative, because there's no alternative narrative, is that this was a pulling up, from the global north. There was a consensus about how things should happen that was spread around the world. And we know that's not true. This extraordinary sort of shift in global well-being has come about through extraordinary efforts that have happened across the global south, in China, in India, in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Brazil, in Pakistan and Bangladesh. You name the group of countries who have, I think, and I've had the privilege of living and working in Indonesia, in India, and Kenya, and watching this extraordinary effort in those countries of borrowing, in a kind of almost bricolage way, ideas from some from the neoliberal consensus. And I think we should be clear about that. There are aspects of the neoliberal consensus they have adopted, but they have changed, altered, reshaped for their own benefit. Mm-hmm. and what you see, the extraordinary growth in China, the extraordinary growth in India, the extraordinary growth in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, into something that we still don't fully understand what are the drivers of that growth. And therefore, we can't fully understand how to continue to build upon that and engage others in that process that these countries have done. So that gets me to where the US is, because the US, I still think, is living in a world in which it believes the story that this progress all happened because the US, because they came to the US vision, they came to the neoliberal consensus. Rather than saying there was this extraordinary period of creativity that has done remarkable things for human well-being that still have enormous challenges ahead. And how can we learn from that? How can we build that? How can we create a new understanding of a global order that befits that and engages in that and builds on that? And I think the US is trying to preserve an order in which it believes it was the dominant sort of power that sort of shaped this, rather than accepting the fact that, in fact, we could be harnessing the energy of this progress at a moment in which that progress is coming to a very hard stop, if not a decline. And the thing that most worries me is we are now at the pivot point, and really 2020 was the exact pivot point, where for the first time global poverty increased, where if we start to project out what is going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see a dramatic sort of slowing in that well-being and change in well-being. And we are not seeing, I think, the US be innovative to say, how can we bring in the experience of these countries that have done such extraordinary things and give them their rightful voice in a new global order that recognizes and builds upon their success. I don't understand. I wish I had an explanation of why the US hasn't done it. I think partly, not partly, I think if I had to give an explanation, it's all domestic politics. It's all because ceding American leadership in the world is less damaging to the world and more damaging to Americans' perception of itself and the tiny sliver the American voting public gives to its understanding of international affairs. And I think if America actually was more willing to lead in bringing in emerging voices that have achieved so much globally and rethinking a global order in which those voices had their rightful say, I actually think it would be extraordinarily strengthening to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that I actually have for the group. I mean, is there a presumption in that it's even up to the United States at this point, right? I mean, are we at a stage where the United States actually lacks the strength and moral authority to retain that leadership and to even manage that process? Or are we sort of tipping into and what sort of other forms of global leadership do we see emerging that might take its place if the United States can't get its act together?
Can I say one thing of that, because I really didn't hear it? I think the problem is that America still has the veto power over others. So I just want to say it's less that it's not imagination, it's more its preservation of its strength and using that veto power to stop change.
Yeah.
But
anybody want to jump in?
Yes, I think that nowadays in Argentina, at least, where I came from, that is a very rich country in terms of resources and so on, we have the 50% of the population under poverty line. So I think that we cannot talk about progress. We cannot talk about post-colonial scenarios. I think that we are living nowadays a recolonization of our region, especially the countries that are part of the so-called lithium triangle, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. And I think that the role of the United States, at least some government parts of the USA that are now in Argentina, for example, talking about the lithium triangle is in a very traditional colonial way to approach the question. We have the South Commander visiting our country 2 weeks ago, and the idea of extractivism as the way of developing our country, I think it's a horrible idea because we know what extractivism is, what kind of displacement of population implies, and what kind of violence against territories and bodies and, especially indigenous population who are the really owners of the land, but they are completely expropriated, means extractivism. So I think that it's not an abstract idea of what this kind of idea of progress and leadership and successful development means. We have a very concrete, violent experience of that kind of policies.
Well, in your writing, I think I almost have this image of neoliberalism enduring as a kind of nuclear fallout.
Yeah.
Long after it's been discredited, it continues to, But yeah, Ranjit, please go ahead.
Just to add to that, and please forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing your argument, but as you were speaking, it struck me that, of course, I'm going to confine myself to India, but there are obvious, analogies with all the other places you mentioned. In this same period where it looks like the economy has done brilliantly, and there has been, on various seemingly objective indices, there's been growth. What I see as a citizen there is a complete leeching away of equity. I see a diminishing of rights and of opportunities. I see that the older as well as new aspirational elites have become more powerful, their consumption is more conspicuous, and even though we're constantly told that that poverty has been dealt with, we know both from lived experience and from unrest and discontent and the unemployment figures that palpably isn't true. Fewer people have benefited from these processes of growth, and a large number of people have been left out, and that has political consequences. There's a reservoir of resentment that then plays into the worst possible forms of identitarian politics. So I see a completely different picture. And I would like to think also of, coming back to our theme, fostering global solidarities. I don't know that we can simply talk about a kind of a genteel rearrangement of what is ultimately a Westphalian order. I think we are probably in the aftermath of the Westphalian order. I don't think there is much to be hoped for in terms of a simple rearrangement of which nation states have a place at the table. I think we have to look at what is happening below, what is happening to those without equity, without entitlement, and see if, I've used this term in other contexts, but see what we can develop in terms of a solidarity of those who are most vulnerable.
And I just want to also say that there should be some cards circulating for questions. In a couple of minutes, we'll turn to questions. I'm curious about, I think there's a lot of discussion about U.S. leadership right now, and I think that there are lots of questions, particularly in the context of Israel and Palestine and the Biden administration in particular, its policies. But I'm also just curious more generally how this kind of bubbling up from below might look like, and where the most interesting and exciting possibilities are. And I don't know. Kohei, maybe this is a question for you, or Peter, feel free to jump in. What are you seeing that gives you some sense of possibility? You talked about the students. Are there other things outside in the broader world that are that perhaps could offer an alternative to the rearrangement of the existing institutions?
Yes, I was really happy to see young students who participated in my workshop and these panels, and they really expressed a serious interest in degrowth communism. And I wouldn't expect that, When I was a student, undergrad at Wesleyan University, 2005-09, no one was really talking about socialism anymore. And, that's like a liberal university, liberal arts college. And, the maximum was of course, gender identity, gender politics, and then Obama got elected. But the question of class was quite absent because the economy was still quite good, and then the age of great moderation and so on. And then, as you just pointed out, even on the global scale, inequality was getting better and so on. So no one was really questioning capitalism. But it's changed. After 30 years of globalization, economic inequality growing, climate crisis gets worse, and then we have so many poly-crisis kind of narratives today. And it's really great that this is bringing some more radical ideas in the discourse that young people are interested in. And this is really bringing some kind of the crisis of the liberal ideas and the crisis of the establishment. And this is why, after a certain point, this power is directed against those students who are being radicalized, right? So this is what we are witnessing today. And I think this is the, really the moment of transformation, I would say, because we used to believe in a kind of narrative that the future will be better. So why don't we just, patiently wait for next 10 years, then everything will be better. Then let's just wait another 10 years, things will be even more better. So it's this progressive idea is actually commonly shared by, I would say, like liberal social democrats. The idea of social democracy is based on this kind of presumption of progressive kind of development. But I think this is the moment of poly-crisis is radically different. It's going to be worse. Climate crisis will get worse and worse and worse. So the situation will be more a concentration of wealth, more disasters in the poverty area and so on. So, this is rather in the progressive degradation. And I don't think in that kind of situation, the old, so I would say it's now old, because old social democratic ideas are no longer shared by many people anymore, especially among the younger generation, because they are the ones who will experience more suffering, right? So they are demanding more rapid change. And we cannot say, oh, the world is not like that, it will change only gradually, and we tell them, the young students and the kids. But I think they are right. They know more correctly what's wrong about this system, and they are correctly interested in the idea of degrowth, socialism, communism, or whatsoever. And this is, I would welcome, because this is really changing. After the collapse of Soviet Union, we didn't have that kind of thing, but now it's changing. I see there some hope.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there were a couple of phrases that I wrote down from all of you that really kind of stuck with me, and one from you, Ranjit, on this subject is and you just evoked it, the possibility of a solidarity of the vulnerable, and Peter, you and I talked about the difficulty of being a, quote, loving critic, and being in community, but also trying to stand up for things within that community in a way that could engender solidarity, or at least keep the conversation going in the hopes of someday building solidarity. What does that look like, being a loving critic?
Often it's in the eye of the beholder. You may think you're being loving, but that may not be the way it's perceived by a lot of other people. I think this is something that I really struggle with a lot, because the question is what is the vocabulary that's available to try to show a sense of solidarity or commitment that will mean anything to the people that you are trying to speak to, when ultimately you want to say that you believe that they, as a collective, have very, very badly gone off course. And so I find in my own writing, I'm constantly trying out different things that might be some way of establishing that sense of love and solidarity that would that doesn't cost me the actual criticism I want to make, or doesn't blunt the force of the criticism I want to make. And I think it's very, very difficult actually to do that, because I think what because in the case of Israel and Jews, and there may well be analogs in other cases, what you see if you scratch the surface is the establishment, whether it's the Israeli government or the American Jewish establishments, its own discourse of solidarity actually turns out to be not actually, as it looks to me, like an actual defense of Jewish safety, but a defense of a certain power position. So you have this very strange situation where there's a discourse that tries to delegitimize and criminalize these pro-Palestine protests because they're a threat to Jewish students. But anyone who's spent time on a college campus will know that Jews are overrepresented in these protest movements. So you are calling for the arrest and suspension, expulsion, sometimes kind of quite brutal arrests of students, a disproportionate number of whom are Jewish, in the name of Jewish safety, right? And so what you're actually doing is basically you have a definition of Jewish safety and solidarity which actually cuts out an entire group of people, right, who essentially become made un-Jewish, right, because they are politically in an opposite position. And that seems to me like an important lesson for a lot of people to learn, that kind of you may think you have safety within a certain identity category, but actually if you move outside of it, and I think, this is part of, to go to your point, this is part of this picture of this economics professor at Emory University was so jarring, right? Because let's be honest, we see pictures like that all the time in America, right? But we don't usually see them of economics professors, people saying, I'm a white economics professor at Emory, but what happens is yeah, you're right. You step outside of this and then you realize actually that maybe these identities don't actually protect you if politically you veer too far off, and then maybe it makes you think a little bit differently about where your solidarity actually lies. So I think that's a question that some younger American Jews are having to actually face now. As it happens today, there was a protest led by friends of mine in Israel who are arrested, of a group of rabbis, American and Israeli rabbis, trying to bring flour to the border with Gaza, arrested, and I think potentially with very, very harsh repercussions. And so they're seeing in Israel the same point, which is how much actually does a Jewish state built on the claim of Jewish safety, and what kind of safety does that actually look at if you actually challenge that state in the name of the beliefs that you have?
Yeah. That video was pretty incredible. She's sort of crying, oh my God, and you're like, oh, that's what it looks like to discover your position in this order, everything that you thought you knew. I'm going to go to some student questions. Obviously, some very bright people in this room. So, first question, and folks just volunteer, or I will pick on you. Do you see AI and digital communication as critical tools in fostering global solidarities, or are they more likely to increase divisions in the world today? Who wants to take that on?
Of course, digital technologies has very good way of communicating each other, and it really increased in certain movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and other climate justice movement. It's really had that kind of potentiality. However, we all know that these social networks, media are full of hate speeches, fake news, and propaganda, and so on. So I don't know. I mean, it's just I cannot say anything very unique and original at this moment. Let's just say it's something very banal. So.
Please, yeah, of course.
I think that is very interesting to think in what sense these digital communications could be a tool for political communities. Mm-hmm. So I think that we were discussing how a practice of political community can be built and how the communication tools can be used inside this objective of building a political community. Mm. So I think it is useful to think in that kind of connection rather than the theme of isolated technologies as itself.
It's really interesting because my primary relationship with social media, and we haven't really talked about AI, so let's maybe put that off to the side, was one of absolute enthrallment. I was a young foreign correspondent who just moved to India, and suddenly I had access to so many interesting people who, I'd have to have located them somehow, somewhere. And then the worm turned and everybody was like, oh, garbage fire, don't spend time on social media. It's not the real world. You're just talking to people like you. And And then a lot of us kind of pulled back from social media and said we're not going to be involved anymore. And it's been interesting in the context of the protest movement for Palestine. Whenever I tell people like, oh, I'm not, they're like, oh, well, what's your Twitter handle? I say, well, my Twitter handle is there, but I'm not active on Twitter anymore. They're kind of shocked and a little bit disgusted, and I think that they associate the kind of because they're like, it's really important to us for organizing, and I think they associate my refusal of it as a kind of haughty superiority, right? Like, I don't get into the muck of that, and I'm much more concerned about, kind of the neoliberal, like, preservation of my time and, not getting sucked into, or like limiting my screen time and et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been thinking about my own kind of assumptions in the journey that I've been on, and I find, well, maybe I should go back on Twitter. Like, maybe I am, because ultimately Twitter, those of us who experienced it at that time, I think, and some of you, we all experienced it together, perhaps a little too much. It was a truly exhilarating thing, and I sometimes wonder if we gave up too much and bought into ideas about the role of technology that made us more passive rather than active. Okay, how can we emphasize the importance of global solidarity given the trend toward isolationism in the U.S.? Are there ways for the U.S. to pull back but remain engaged in positive ways? Joel, I'd love to hear you on this. Because you have some thoughts, also on some missed opportunities. Yeah.
No, it sort of surprises me that the U.S. doesn't take the opportunity to say, especially in light of its fixation on on the topic of the next panel, the shift to a new Cold War. It would seem to me this is an extraordinary opportunity for the United States to engage with other countries in a true dialogue about what reshaping the institutional order, to the extent that you have confidence in the institutional order and some kind of multilateral system could have an impact, that actually, even in its own Cold War mentality, if it was the country that was going out to say, this is time to change, these institutions that were created 75 years ago, in a completely different global situation, have run their course. And we believe this is the most opportune time at a pivotal moment in global history to start to rethink these institutions. And for us to be an important player in that. I think there's very little domestic if you will, opposition to it, mostly because I don't think this is a very important issue in the domestic political dialogue in the United States, which gives freedom for the U.S. to play a very different role on the global order that would ultimately, I think, do much better job in engaging the rest of the world in this competition that the U.S. says it's so worried about in the Cold War. To say, look, we are a country that is deeply open to rethinking this in a different way. So it is actually frustrating for me why the U.S. doesn't take the opportunity to play that leadership role, or that role in saying we are open to having this dialogue, we are open to forums that recreate and rethink these institutions, and put that on a global agenda.
Yeah. A question that Ranjit would be great. Yes, please. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I worry about is that I don't think we don't have pipelines that are very effective to actually, for ordinary Americans with the kind of diversity of American experience, to influence the making of American foreign policy. And I think, to me, one of the really critical moments that I think I look back to is the moment of the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020. Of both of his insurgent campaigns, and the way in which those came out of the Occupy movement, and they became a transmission mechanism for some rethinking in the Democratic Party on economic questions, and a bit of a move away from the ideas that were prevalent during the Clinton administration, even the Obama administration. Yet there was no pipeline from through the Sanders campaign to influence the Biden administration's foreign policy at all, right? And so you have a kind of president who in some ways kind of looks a little bit like a latter-day Lyndon Johnson, right? Who's kind of like, has internalized certain progressive tendencies from below on domestic policy, but on foreign policy is really locked into a very rigid, it seems to me, kind of Cold War vision that I think you're right, that actually the American public is not bought into. And that there are a whole group of Americans out there who I think could think about foreign policy in really different ways. I mean, I think that one of the most disastrous things about the Israel-Palestine debate is it serves as a filter that filters out people who might have more heterodox views on foreign policy in general. I mean, if you just watch, I read Ilhan Omar's transcripts from how she behaved on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Just the questions she asked the administrator, they're so radically different than almost everyone else on the committee because they weren't coming from an exceptionalist perspective. They were literally the kinds of questions that you might get if you put someone from Niger on the committee or someone from South Asia on the committee. She's asking those questions like, why does America have troops here? What are they doing? As opposed to, how does America counter Russia or Chinese influence in this part of the world? And because it prevents those people, I think we don't have strong voices in Congress who are warning about America's policy on China and Taiwan, right? Which is like the potential greatest calamity besides climate change that I see, right? Of a massive third world war. And we don't have those heterodox voices there, even in a Democratic administration.
And I mean, on India, she was a really, really important
Yes.
voice. And then, you know, when she got chucked off the committee, it was a tremendous loss because I think that the lack of sophistication of the American approach to India is just mind-boggling to me.
So the problem is America needs to take the responsibility for the mess that they created, but at the same time, we don't want, like we, the non-Americans, want Biden or Trump to take that leadership, right? So it's really hard. I mean,
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I know that we have a hard stop. So, and this is a good one, and Ranjit, perhaps you could jump in on this one first. How can transnational solidarity realistically evolve beyond the nation state, especially considering current global fragmentation and the appeal of nationalism?
Yeah, I'm going to build off what you just said about your image of
Your mic.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to build off this idea of the trope of the pipeline that you just put into action, because I had a point here that I tend to be a great connoisseur of irrelevant things. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Gramsci's idea of traditional and organic intellectuals. And I think there's room for that discussion here, because what tends to happen, particularly with foreign policy, that it is completely the preserve and dominion of expert culture, of a delightful word, wonks. But they tend not always to be open to other kinds of criteria and questions about what might define the relationship among countries. So the entire mode tends to be competitive. Alliances tend to be with elites with whom you share certain core values, which are always defined in geopolitical, ultimately military terms. And everything else is somehow characterized as somehow soft. Questions that have to do with some of the things I was talking about earlier. What do you do with entitlements? What do you do with the rights of women in another nation state that you're dealing with? What about the rights of religious minorities? What do you have to say about ways in which you might build capacity to fight the climate catastrophes that are upon you? But that pushes you really into this scenario where there's, I don't want to make a caricature of this, but there are elites that will not give up their power, and they will seek global alliances that bring the powerful together. And the voices of the vulnerable, the powerless, are always somehow left out of this. So the challenge is to how to get these together and how to find ways of participating in larger political processes. I don't have a prognostication for how this is to be done, but I think this is something we need to recognize, and which is one reason why this cannot be business as usual.
A Davos of the disenfranchised is perhaps what we need. I'm going to call it time because we are at time. But what a fantastic conversation. Such a wonderful treat to spend some time talking to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.